Hello and welcome to FireDEV, a fireside chat with people in the industry. Today, my guest is Ted Wu. Welcome, Ted.
Well, hello.
Hello, Ted. So, how are you doing? Let's start with that.
I'm good. Yeah, I'm doing well. Just got back from Chicago for July 4th celebration. That was really fun. Got to see some friends and explore downtown.
Well, that's good stuff. Good stuff. So, you work at Airbnb. You're a software engineer there. What do you do at Airbnb? Specifically, because Airbnb is not a small company anymore. Even though I don't know if they internally still considering themselves a startup, but they are the juggernaut now.
Yeah, so what I do is I'm part of the hotels team. So previously I was working at a startup called HotelTonight, and the startup got acquired by Airbnb, and then it basically now there's an organization in Airbnb that is the hotels division. So I'm on that team, and I'm actually uh, a software engineer that is working on a lot of growth efforts. So we have a growth team out here, and so I'm basically leading that.
Okay, sounds interesting. So, tell us about your, journey as an engineer from, you studied computer science at Northwestern University. Then, you worked at Hotel Tonight that got acquired by Airbnb. Before that, you worked at Chartboost. How did all, the unique experiences, contribute and, the skill set as well? Because obviously software engineer is a very broad, term.
Yeah, so my journey, starting from Northwestern University, I kind of stumbled upon computer science, kind of in the middle of university. I just took a few computer science classes and I loved it. One of the main courses that I really like taking was human computer interaction, and so that was the first time I was introduced into kind of front end design, front end engineering, and basically how the design of websites or apps and how humans interact with it. That was kind of the main course that I really like enjoying. And then after that, I started working at so I interned at Chartboost as an intern, focusing on front end engineering to building dashboards and the front end website for it. And after graduation, I decided that I wanted to go back to Chartboost because of the team, the culture, and also just kind of the fast paced environment at a startup. So I went back to Chartboost after graduation, and that was kind of the start of my understanding of what software engineering is really like. Taking computer science classes at university is very different from working at a startup, and then building actual real world products, and then building real world products, and then having actual customers. So that was kind of like the big, very very big difference in theoretical knowledge and actually the application of that knowledge.
Oh, yeah.
And after Chartboost, we um, Chartboost is a B2B company, so it focuses on advertising, and then it integrates with other businesses like other mobile game companies. And then during those 2 years, I learned a lot from you know understanding how to work in a B2B environment. And then eventually, I decided I wanted to focus on working at a different company that is more customer facing. And that's why I joined Hotel Tonight. And then, yeah, and after that, it got acquired by Airbnb. And so obviously, Airbnb is a huge consumer product. And so I've been working on that ever since.
Okay, so before we talk a bit more about Hotel Tonight and Airbnb, just talking about Chartboost. What was Chartboost's secret or I guess way of operating? Because I remember using a bunch of our platforms, including Chartboost, RevMob, AdMob, and a few other ones as well. And I remember Chartboost always paid really well. for their impressions. I remember back in the day, in the early days of the iOS App Store, and also the Google Play Store, I was developing applications and games. And I recall when I had, basically an ad mediation framework, one that I built myself in there, and it mediated between a bunch of different, ad networks. Chartboost being one of them. I remember seeing Chartboost earnings was always a big chunk of it, and that was always the one that looked like, okay, that's something to actually get excited about. Whereas sometimes I would see some of the other ones, and they would literally be so insignificant. It was as if they didn't send me anything. So, like, what was Chartboost doing, and is that still the case to this day? Do you know?
Yeah, so I can't really speak on till this day, but back when I was working there, it was one of the leading ad networks that uh, basically programmatic advertising platform out there, which helps in-app monetization for publishers. So basically, when we call publisher, we mean like people who own mobile apps. Chartboost is mainly targeting mobile games, and so it's basically a platform that allows mobile games to advertise other mobile games, and having advertisers who want to go on board with the platform to advertise their games onto um, uh, advertise their mobile games to the network. And so basically it's like a win-win situation, right? So you have advertisers who want to spend money to kind of showcase, other targeted users what their game is about. And then you also have, mobile game developers who mainly care about building the mobile games, but not and need a way to actually make it into a business. Then Chartboost is actually a perfect platform for that.
Okay, so Chartboost, as you mentioned, is business to business. Unlike Airbnb, which obviously has business to business, but you also have business to consumer as well, which is probably what most people know it as. The website you go on, you book a room or a flat or a mansion sometimes. It's like a new way of booking hotels effectively. Whereas with Chartboost, because you was dealing with businesses directly, and obviously the ad sort of industry, what were the sort of unique technical challenges that you faced as a software engineer, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so some of the technical challenges, building for business to consumer platforms like HotelTonight and Airbnb, the main technical challenge is that you have very different customer base, right? So, some like compared to focusing on like Chartboost, for example, when you build features, you can do user interviews with these advertisers and what tooling they want to build. But if you kind of go back to platforms like Airbnb and HotelTonight, it's harder to do that because the customer base have very different use cases. So the way I see it is like there's many different personas of a customer, and so in order to deliver the best experience, it has to be very tailored to what that customer is about, right? So an example would be we can have a family who wants to book rooms or book hotels, and they have certain requirements. For example, they might need more beds, versus you have a single traveler who is willing to kind of book very last minute, and but they're very cost conscious, right? So these are two very different types of personas to different customers that will want to book, and you want to provide the best experience for that, right? And so the technical challenges here is more identifying these personas. So we have like we built sort of an example service. We built an API service that would, kind of figure out what type of preferences you like, based on the interactions you have with the platform. So, for example, if you click on hotels that have a lot more, that are more like luxurious, then we might think that you prefer more luxurious branded hotels versus like a budget hotel. Or it could be like um, you always view these type of boutique hotels, like hotels that are more creative but smaller, not like big brand hotels. Then that's kind of the persona that we kind of develop for that. So just providing different search results and different experience for a different customer, that's the biggest technical challenge, I would say.
Okay. As an engineer who's worked both in the hotel industry, we know Hotel Tonight, and then Airbnb, which is more of a typical sharing economy, what are some of the key differences and challenges that you've seen building the platforms for these industries, and how do you, overcome them? And what are like the similarities as well? Because they're not totally, opposite industries either.
Yeah. So I would say the two main differences, I mean, I'll start with similarities first, right? So it's a it's a platform, right? You have the supply and demand, right? So on the hotel side, the supply is you onboard these new hotels. You have your sales team that will reach out to hotels to basically convince them to be on the platform. On the Airbnb side is host. So host, in terms of host, you have, you know, hosts ranging like people like me and you, if we want to host our house for an Airbnb for a weekend, we're considered hosts. But you also have hosts that have, multiple properties across the country, across the world, that has a property management company that manages these properties. So the host side from Airbnb, the supply side on Airbnb changes, is the range is a lot bigger compared to hotels, like where you have different types of hotels, but the tooling that you build for these hotels is generally going to be similar, right? You don't have like different, the needs are relatively similar compared to Airbnb in terms of the supply side. And on the demand side, I would say it's pretty similar in terms of, the customer base from Airbnb and hotel industry. Like majority of the families, I would say, target Airbnbs more just because they have a bigger space, they have kitchen space, and it is generally better for a bigger group of people. um, Hotels, you have, more of the business travelers, or, backpackers, or just kind of, people who stay in hotel rooms, and generally the max occupancy is 4 people, right? So that's kind of like from the business side, that's like the main difference. But I would say in terms of the the companies that I worked, so HotelTonight and Airbnb, I would say the biggest difference I would say is Airbnb is very good with growth and traffic. So the demand side is very high. There's a lot of customers that are searching. Um, you know, During COVID, there was a stop in marketing spend, but with Airbnb, the brand is very, very strong, right? And at Hotel Tonight, when I'm right now I'm leading growth, right? Um, on the Hotel Tonight side, it's the supp- the demand is not as high. The brand is, obviously we spend ad money on brand, but there's a lot of competition with other hotel OTAs out there, right? So there's like, Booking.com, Kayak, there's Expedia. There's a lot of different competitors out there that is harder to develop that brand, other than obviously spending a lot more ad spend, right? Or brand campaigns. So I would say that's the main difference. Is Airbnb is very strong on the demand side, but hotel industry, there's so much competition to distinguish your business with other OTAs. The difference is very, very, it's really hard to distinguish between that, and therefore it's hard to develop that brand.
Okay. So Airbnb, we all, I think everyone knows, is a huge, sharing platform now. The Hotel Tonight it's not a company that I've heard of, previously before. Like, how big was Hotel Tonight before Airbnb?
So Hotel Tonight's probably around 200 people. It's like a pretty mid-sized startup. Series D or E, kind of forget, but it's generally the size. The engineering team is about like 20 to 30 people. And then we have contractors in Europe, but generally the product team is relatively small, obviously compared to Airbnb, which is huge. But yeah, so in terms of, I can kind of talk about what Hotel Tonight is about. So it's an app that it started with an just iOS and Android app that basically provides really good hotel deals. And then initially it started with like you can book that hotel on the day of, right? And this which is why the name's called Hotel Tonight. So on the day of you get really, really good deals because hotels have unsold rooms that they want to sell instead of just losing that money. And then eventually as the business grew and there was a lot of demand, they started, adding, becoming a week. You can start booking a weekend ahead. And now we kind of built the feature of having you can now book 365 days ahead, right? So that's kind of the general idea of how the business started is to do last minute deals. So you can go to the app and then you can have really good last minute deals. And now obviously when we build up the business, we started, we built a web platform because we realized that a lot of people like to book on web, and so the web platforms also developed.
Okay. And does Hotel Tonight still exist as a website and an app, or has it been fully integrated within the Airbnb, platform?
So it's actually a standalone. So it's operated separately in terms of it's still working and still thriving, both the app and the website. And in terms of integration, there's definitely projects that are along the way that we're thinking about, but it's generally still uh, under development right now.
Okay. And is there obviously you've briefly touched on it just right now, but is there any crossover with the tech and the technology into the Airbnb platform? Because having used Airbnb myself before, I see rooms on there, I see whole houses on there, but sometimes I do come across hotel rooms on there as well. Is that to do with Hotel Tonight, or is that just hotels that have added their rooms on?
Yeah, so there's definitely like a way. So for Airbnb, you do see some hotels, and these hotels are on um, Airbnb. That's part of the. It's kind of the initial move is to like start introducing hotel supply into Airbnb, and we have a plan to actually integrate more closely with all our hotel supply that we onboarded to Airbnb. But that's kind of like the long-term vision. And in terms of technology, it's a very different tech stack, right? So Airbnb is, focused on service-oriented architecture. It has, many different microservices that handle specific business use cases. But Hotel Tonight is actually, a monorail still, built in Ruby on Rails, and the infrastructure is also different. But we also migrated some of the infrastructure over to Airbnb just because Airbnb has really good infrastructure built in, the infrastructure tooling that we can basically use, and they have teams to support it versus like we before we would have to uh, you know, build our own infrastructure, and then there's a lot of pain points over there too.
Okay, so what's you've touched on the technologies a bit, but what sort of specific technologies does Hotel Tonight use? And, how does that differ to Airbnb? I'm talking about like frameworks. I'm talking about, programming languages, cloud platforms. I'm sure they use cloud platforms as well, like, AWS and Google Cloud, for example. So, what are the nuts and bolts in terms of the technology that's involved in these two platforms? How do they differ? In from a technical standpoint, when you really get down to it.
Yeah, so in terms of languages, it's Airbnb used to use Ruby on Rails, and then eventually switched to Java, JVM based architecture, and then uh, Hotel Tonight is actually just Ruby on Rails, and there's no plan to actually migrate it to using Java, just because we have to rewrite everything, and it works as is. And in terms of cloud-based technologies, we both use AWS, and then in terms of frameworks on the front end, most both use TypeScript, and for iOS and Android, it's the same. So the main difference is the kind of the backend language and framework. We use Ruby on Rails. They use Kotlin and Java. So that's like the main difference. A lot of the tooling that we use are now shared. So we basically are trying to mimic as closely as possible in terms of the infrastructure side.
Okay. Obviously, Kotlin, one of the new hot, languages out there, the successor to Java effectively, and then you've got, Swift on the iOS side, the successor to Objective-C. Is there plans of Hotel Tonight migrating to something like Kotlin, or instead of using their current technologies? That makes sense from a technical standpoint.
Yes, I believe on the Android development side, we are slowly migrating some pieces of core booking flow into Kotlin. Just Kotlin is you know less lines of code. It's more
Yes.
readable. Um, but in terms of that definitely reduces the cost of development. But there's also the just cost of migrating into the different framework as well. So it's always a tech excellence piece that it's a trade-off that we as engineers always have to think about is migration of this code quality, is that does the benefit outweigh the risk, and also the risk of some bugs that get introduced, or development time, or developer resourcing. These are all things that we think about.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because you don't want to, migrate a working app, a working platform to some new fancy shiny technology that might be great, but then the app's not working, the backend's not working well, and just you end up destroying the reputation you have with customers just because you wanted to migrate to, obviously in this case, Kotlin, for example, instead of using your existing one. But then there's also that dilemma of when do you migrate, because it's one of those things. Certain decisions, certain areas of your business, you will have to migrate. It's an inevitability. Otherwise, you're just sticking on old technology, which will limit you in other ways, especially if it's not getting updated or doesn't have the same level of support. So obviously, that does come with its technical, challenges as well. In terms of scaling, because that's one of the things that I hear from entrepreneurs and engineers that work at these big companies, is the creating of the product is one thing, but then scaling it to be able to handle hundreds of thousands, millions, or even more users is a totally different ballgame. That's where the real difficulties lie, even though the average person doesn't see that side of things. But like, how do you overcome those challenges, and what are your tips and tricks, having been in the industry?
Yeah, so in terms of scaling, there's always there's two different ways to do it, right? So in terms of the backend side, uh, you have vertical scaling, which is basically essentially saying I will buy bigger machines, I will buy bigger caches, I will buy basically spending money to scale, right?
Hmm.
So when you have database records that are kind of increasing, what you want to do to scale. The first thing you want to think about is okay, the vertical scaling is you basically pay money to scale, right? So you pay AWS some costs and then you scale that. The other way is you have horizontal scaling is when you start more complicated things like database sharding. You have different partitions and there's different ways to do horizontal scaling that actually complicates a lot of basically like increasing different machines, which is basically increasing different nodes. um, and that's the disadvantage of that though is that you it's a lot more complex, right? So once you set up a multi-node system, that adds the complexity not only to the engineers but also just to maintain it. It's very hard to you know manage that complexity. um but that scaling is the type of thing where like when you reach that point and you have to do it, then you do it, right? But a lot of the times it's also about like when a business starts planning something in the beginning, they usually try to have scale in mind. But startups, when they start, it's like, okay, let's get customers, let's build fast, let's build features, and then the scaling is only a thing when it becomes a problem. Then there's a plan to figure out how to scale that, right? So I would say the some of the tips that I would say that kind of work for me when I design these systems is that initially it depends on what phase of the company you are at, right? So if you're more of a startup, so similar to when we're at working at Hotel Tonight, there's an infra team that would focus on scaling only when we build all these features and realize, we do need to scale once we get new customers, right? We don't want to build products and then try to over engineer things in the beginning and then eventually like there's not enough customers using the feature or not enough customers that were actually overload our systems. We don't want to over engineer that in the beginning. So we only build the product that are needed. And then because in the startup world, things move fast. And then when we need to scale, we will scale. And at first we will look at horizontal scaling or vertical scaling, depending on the specific use case for that. And for big companies like Airbnb, scaling is mostly controlled, like pretty abstracted away from the product team. So I work on the product team. Scaling usually on the infrastructure side is handled by a dedicated infrastructure team that would prevent scaling from prevent issues from like systems being overloaded. They're definitely more of a longer term roadmap that would prevent this from happening. So they'll focus on scaling kind of a longer term. And it's not like startup, you build product and then scaling it happens kind of later. This is more like more proactive. I would say bigger companies, you need to be more proactive on this, just because your customer base is a lot more. So when you design the system, when you think about system architecture, you need to kind of like have a plan for it. And also with every product that you build, you need to figure out, okay, so what resources are being added, what are the scaling risk, and these are things that they big companies have to think about.
Okay, so talking about scaling, and we touched on the technologies used. You talked about using Kotlin for the Android side, and then iOS will be something else. Why not go down the route of having more of a unified code base and having using Flutter or React Native or Angular, something like that, and just having it, multiply from that single code base. Would that not be better and easier to maintain from a scalability perspective and just in general?
Yeah, so we definitely look into that as well. Um, the main challenges for that is we do have the main challenges for migrating that is it's you need a lot of expertise in people who built a lot of Flutter applications, things like that in production, right? And so it's really hard because we already have the expertise in iOS, we have dedicated Android team, and then we obviously have full stack engineers that build kind of on the web and mobile website. It's 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 something that is a possibility that we think about. So for example, React Native, but we also have been looking into kind of the cons of using React Native, right? So one of them is, yeah, what I talked about is the um, the expertise. We don't really have that expertise in it's very specific knowledge base, right, and skill set. But the other thing is also, there's a lot of things that native developers can provide, and like a lot of the native features that only happen for so for example, iOS, they would release new iOS platform changes, and native developers can easily kind of build that in, versus like now you versus React Native, you would have all developers, you want to be all of them to be expert in JavaScript, and some of the times these support doesn't happen immediately. A lot of the native features don't aren't supported immediately compared to when you build for the native platform. It's available immediately, and also like there's also dependence on React Native itself. So like, or Flutter. So like there's the dependency on relying on these two platforms is just kind of like the trade-off of the risk of iOS platform versus, because React Native is owned by Facebook. So like if they don't have support for React Native because of whatever reason, and then they decide to have less support for that platform, or even shut it down, like these are all risks that is being considered.
Okay, so in your experience, working on a successful platform like Hotel Tonight, Airbnb, what contributes to its success? Like how important is the engineering side versus the design side? Because that's one thing I've noticed about something like Airbnb or let's say Uber, one of these newer companies that's disrupting already pre-existing industries, is their design is on point. Their design is very good. I use Airbnb. It's very nice. It looks good. It works well. Then if I go on to not booking.com, but like a hotel's own website, it's a miracle if you can even navigate it. So like how much is it engineering and how much of it is it design?
Yeah. So I would say it works. Both design and engineering are very important in building the best product. But I would say on the Airbnb, I work with many designers in the past, and honestly, Airbnb has probably one of the top design teams in the world. And if you look at um, a lot of the design systems that they built, it's very impressive, and I think that kind of stems from our CEO, Brian Chesky. He used to study design, and I think that really you can really tell from a lot of the all hands and a lot of the kind of, if you look at his public interviews, he talks a lot about design, right? So how do we build a product that's very intuitive for all types of customers, right? So you have customers who might not have um, who has accessibility needs, right? Or customers who are, maybe are not super good with, using apps or website, like things like that. It's just to have the design be able to solve a lot of these problems. And that is kind of the main core of Airbnb as well. And engineers are kind of like one way to build a foundation to support that design. So when we build products, we always have a meeting with a designer, the engineering team, the product team. Like it's a very cross collaboration type of culture where all types of different functions will work together and bring out their concerns, or also just bring out ideas and then use that to kind of build the product that is the most intuitive for users. We also have one main thing that we also do is experimentation. It's a really big way to kind of like, okay, let's have a control group and a candidate group. Let's roll out the feature, but let's test kind of the impact of what that product is. Because if you think about it, like sometimes even a small change on design, so maybe like changing a button right here, can really impact the customers that you don't know until you actually have the experimentation to figure out like, okay, like what is the actual impact? Because without it, you would basically be guessing like, okay, like I think if we make this design change, make this product change, we think that the customers will do X, Y, and Z. But a lot of times that's not the case. We actually get a lot of learnings from running these experiments. But in general, design is very big at Airbnb.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, you can just tell by its app and its website that design is definitely an important part. And it's not, overlooked. It's like Apple, I would say. Yeah, they got strong engineers, but their design team is definitely a huge focus over at Apple and at Airbnb. So, you attended Northwestern University, which is known for its strong computer science program. How did, your academic background in computer science, how did that influence your career as an engineer, and were there any specific skills that you learned at Northwestern University that really helped you? Because obviously you're going to learn some coding stuff, some computer science stuff, but I'm talking about more specific ones. Is there anything that you felt Northwestern University really brought to the plate, that if someone went there versus another university, that would really have an edge?
Yeah, of course. So one main course that I would say that kind of stood apart from all the other classes that I've taken is we all the engineers at Northwestern with their freshman year, so their first year when they go in, they all have to take a course called Design Thinking Communication. So essentially, what this class does is that regardless of what type of engineering you are, you could be a computer science who writes programming languages, or you could be a mechanical engineer actually, you know, designing a car engine, for example. Any type of engineering, if you're in engineering school, you would have to take this intro course called Design Thinking Communication, which essentially pairs you up with a client, a real world client. Usually it's a client, kind of a nearby company in Chicago, right? So you would work with the client to come up with a solution to a problem that they would propose. So, for example, like a really funny example would be like, we have the Shed Aquarium in Chicago, and the basically they have problems where like they want to design a shoe for a penguin, right? So Shed Aquarium has a bunch of penguins, and they want to design a good shoe for the penguins, so the penguins' feet don't get hurt, or it's at least comfortable for the penguins' feet. So like that's kind of an example project that happens at one of these courses where you would have to think about solutions. You would draw the design, you would figure out, you know, actually build a prototype from that, um, for that client. So that's kind of a project that every engineering student would have to go through. And this really forces you to kind of apply the theoretical knowledge that you built in school and to actually apply in the real world. And you actually have a client, and obviously the client knows that we're all students, so they're not gonna be like demanding any like they're not gonna be super demanding, right? But they're at least gonna have meetings that we would have interviews with, we would talk to them about, and then that kind of mimics the real world. Like when you try to build a product for a customer in the real world, you would have to, understand where they're coming from, understand their pain points, and after that, you kind of go through the development life cycle. So that's one of my favorite courses. Another one, another course that I really enjoy is we kind of like I mentioned before, human computer interaction course. So this is for majority computer science students. But essentially, it was my intro to what front end engineering was about. And then we would have to build, websites or a web platform to solve a particular problem. But we come up with the problem ourselves. So, like a lot of cool examples would be like, back in the days, grocery shopping or delivery service is like right now we have DoorDash and Uber Eats, but back then it wasn't that prevalent. So a lot of the students would try to come up with, that course would build a project to like, order delivery from these type of restaurants and then they'll handle delivery. It's kind of more on the understanding the front end side of things, and that's kind of my intro to front end engineering, and I really liked it. And yeah, so a lot of these courses contribute to what my career, I would say. It's just the exploration phase, but also just like understanding how to build products for different customers. And in order to do that, you need to kind of do user interviews, user research. You have to do experimentation. You would have to come up with different types of designs, and then based on the design, you kind of pick the solution. So yeah, that's mostly it.
So as as the technology landscape, continues to evolve, what are some of the emerging trends and advancements that you see in engineering that you find exciting that will, affect Airbnb and the broader sharing economy as a whole?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've been thinking about that a lot recently as well. And recently, with the rise of different AI tooling, and just in terms of like I think ChatGPT was kind of one of the first um, product that was released into the world, and then everyone's like, wow, like AI is kind of the next big thing. But if you think about it, like the a lot of these AI tooling, it has already existed, but ChatGPT is the first one to kind of like build that interface to have, and obviously the marketing was very good to have everyone try out ChatGPT, and then people would like ask them questions, people would try it out, people would like test it, and obviously with more data that is being inputted into these models, it gets better, it gets smarter, it gets to do a lot of um, it basically just improves exponentially as more people interact with it, right? So I would say AI is probably one of the big spaces that I personally think will be very disruptive in the travel industry, and in the sharing economy as well. Just because with more data on the customer, or the data on how the customer interacts with the platform, you could really provide like one good example is like recommendations, right? How do we build a product that would recommend you the best hotels or the best rooms possible for you based on the profile that you are? And a lot of them is like having the machine learn about, basically have a model determine, like, spit out a score, and based on the score, we determine what is actually relevant to you. It's kind of similar to how Google has done it back in the day when, like, if you look at Google search results, it's you want relevant search results, right? You want relevant YouTube videos. You don't want like random videos that you don't care about, right? So that's kind of like the main one. Um, and the another one is also I what I personally think is like a lot of the customer service. Obviously we want to provide the best customer service product out there. We want to have human interaction, but there's also a lot of things that the customer service team will have to handle manually that could be solved by AI. I wouldn't say AI specifically. I think AI is just a term that people kind of throw out a lot. But I would just say like automation is one thing that can improve the efficiency of all teams across the board.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think that's a good distinction that you made between AI, which is a very broad term people use, and automation. Because the funny thing is, people talk about AI, ChatGPT, Google Bard, any of these other AI models as if they're a very new phenomenon. Like the concept of AI has been around for decades. You know, AI implemented in some way or another, whether it's in a video game, pathfinding AIs, or whether it's AI for detecting, your watching habits on Netflix, has been around for years and years and years. Like, you know, a good few decades, even like some sort of AI has been in products, and you've been interacting with them. But I think that's a very good distinction, that it is definitely the automation side of it, because I use Chat GPT a lot, every day. And especially when I'm coding, I'm trying to solve something, instead of going to Googling, the problem, for example, if I'm getting some error in a project, and then opening up, you know how it is. You Google it, then you open 10 links up. Part of it's Stack Overflow, some of it's Reddit, some of it's YouTube, and then trawling through them and finding comments and just going into this sort of rabbit hole trying to find the solution to what you want. I put it in Chat GPT. Sometimes I literally just copy and paste the error from my text editor. I'll put it in, and it'll come back with a couple of paragraphs and usually some code, or hints, actual steps of how to fix it. It doesn't always work, but it's really good. And then if it comes back and it's not quite what I want, I can say, that's not what I wanted. Can you expand on this? Or can you expand on this aspect that you've mentioned? It's not clear enough. And then you'll come back with more information. Because if I go on Stack Overflow with a bit of Googling, I find a solution, but the solution, there isn't much information there. I would have to do more Googling on that solution to find more information. Whereas with this, it's literally curating and automating all of that process. So yeah, these AI models, the power of it, and I think it's good that you mentioned the customer service aspect, because there's a lot that it can do, especially once it's got a more specific AI. You don't want a general AI model for this, but a very specific AI model for customer service, especially one that's linked in with all of the other customer service requests that have come about prior to this
Hmm.
particular one. And if they're, especially something like on Airbnb, if there's a customer request that occurs, one of the things, for example, I was at an Airbnb just a weekend gone with a few friends. We had like a boys' weekend away, and well, there was a problem. The boiler wasn't working. Like the owner came over when we arrived, told us that the boiler isn't working. There's no heat in, and we're in contact with Airbnb to try and get either all or some of our money back. But the
Hmm.
funny thing is, Airbnb has said there's not enough evidence to basically, state to go around, giving the refund. But when we did a bit of research, there was a review from a few weeks back, stating the exact problems we had. If there was some sort of AI model that had scanned all the reviews of that particular host and that particular property, they would have seen that, okay, this problem that we've just mentioned was already there, because the owner, the host, made it out as if it's just happened, and they tried to play, the card of we'll be sympathetic, which we was, but then there was a bunch of other issues. And again, I feel like an AI model would have done that more efficiently than a human just looking at our request and saying no, but then not having the context of all the other reviews where there are reviews showing there's been the same problem that's already existed, and the fact that he didn't let us know about it, prior to it. Because if he had let us know, we would have had the right to cancel and get a refund. But because we didn't know, and because he already knew, and there's proof of that, there is that thing. I feel like a AI model would have done a better job. So that leads me on to my next point, question of,
Hmm.
those are some of the technologies you find interesting and that you're looking into. Like, how can some of these technologies, outside of what we've just discussed, you know be used to benefit and upgrade the platform, upgrade Airbnb?
Yeah, so I think what you mentioned about reviews, that's a really good example of, sifting through, having the computer sift through all the reviews and come up with patterns, right? So, like, obviously, we leave millions of reviews, and you can't have a human look through each review and then figure out a pattern for that, right? So, obviously, we have a team that would basically have all this data set, which is an interesting data set for either positive reviews, neutral reviews, or negative reviews, right? And so, um, the technology that we have right now is able for us to kind of like input these data set and then come up with either correlation of these reviews or some sort of learning from these reviews, right? And other than reading through them, we can actually um, train them and see if we can categorize them into different ones. And these learnings are really important because imagine another example would be like, you have amenities for a house, right? For each room, you would have different amenities, and it's really hard for a host. So, like, the host would basically write down all the amenities the room has. Right now, it's a very manual process. But in the future, once we have a lot of data set of these pictures, what if we can say, okay, um, you have a scan of your room, and based on that scan of your rooms, we are able to identify what amenities you have, right? So instead of having the host kind of list out manually each one, you click like, okay, we have a refrigerator, we have a dishwasher, we have a laundry room, things like that. What if in the future you have a way where the host can take a video of their home or some sort of um, have some sort of data set. I don't know how to collect that data set, but once you have the data set, it can automatically populate the amenities that you have in your room versus manually doing it, right? So these are just like examples of what this new AI technology can do. But there's also a lot of the image scanning technology that already exists, but there's definitely a lot of improvement that needs to be made. And the once the product is built, I'm pretty sure it's not going to be like 100% right that you get the amenities right. Maybe in the meantime, you would need to have some sort of human person, human agent to determine to look at ones that the machine learning model doesn't have a huge confidence in. And I think that happens to a lot of different like products that other companies has as well, right? So, for example, um, to determine who is a fraudster on your platform, right now, I would guarantee that majority of the companies use machine learning to determine whether a customer is a fraudster or not. And then based on that, there's some times where the machine learning model doesn't know. It's kind of a gray area where they're like, it's like 55% chance that there'll be a fraudster. You don't want to take the risk of just like marking them as a fraudster, right? Because if you mark, let's just say I mark me and the platform marks me and you as fraudster, and we're actually good customers trying to book a room on Airbnb, we would be really mad. We would contact customer support, or we might just even say we'll never use the platform again, right? So in the people who are in the gray zone, there's a team that are like specialists in maybe fraud. They'll take a look at these customers who are in the gray zone and then determine whether they're good customer or a fraudster. And that information, that decision that they make feeds back into the model. So the next time the model looks at someone like, maybe I was in the gray area, but then they marked me as a good customer. The next time they look at a customer like me, they will mark me as good. And that's kind of the beauty of this technology, is that as you get more data, the model gets better, and when the model gets better, it kind of feeds back into the model. So the feedback loop kind of improves the model tremendously, and that kind of solves a lot of the kind of the human part of things, because the manual work is a lot, and it's not cost efficient, right? And so I think that's kind of the emerging technology that will continue to improve, and it will continue to be incorporated into a lot of these platforms, not just Airbnb or Hotel Tonight, but across different platforms out there.
Oh yeah, I mean, I do love that idea of, especially if you're a host, being able to not have to manually input all the amenities, all the, features that you're effectively offering. I think two potential ways of helping that can be one. When, let's say let's say if it's video based, they do the video, it comes up with a list of amenities, but they themselves have to, you know, click yes or no to each one of them, instead of it just automatically just going to the stage of these are the amenities. So if it picks up a kettle, they have to say yes or no. If it picks up a dishwasher, it has to say yes or no, for example. I think that's definitely one way of keeping it, the accurate side of it. And another way to further enhance the accuracy would be using, do you know how you have capture form like Google Capture, and they'll
Hmm.
show you a bunch of images, and they'll say, select all the, tiles that have traffic lights in them, or all the tiles that have a car in them. And some of them, or some of the images, are ones they're testing you on, and some they're getting data to see, because they can't manually go through all of these images. Sometimes it's words that they've scanned from, Google has that project of, scanning all of the world's books. So some of it's just, words that they've scanned from a book. They're utilizing all of their users to be able to say, okay, this is this letter, this is this word, and then they'll say, okay, 90% have said it's this particular word, even though we wasn't actually checking them on that. Day was helping us check it. I think that would be a great way of, in improving the data set for Airbnb, because when a host or a user, when they need to verify something like that can pop up. It doesn't have to be Google Capture. It could be their own thing. One thing they definitely know is correct. Then the other thing, they're like, okay, is they have a box around a kettle, but they say kettle, fridge, and a couple of other options. And then once they determine that, okay, most people are saying kettle, it's probably a kettle. I think that'll really help with the check-in and the AI models as well. And obviously, there's going to be a teething, process to it. And I think the other beauty of the feature that you've just, talked about is, if I'm a host, I might look around my, property, let's say a flat, for example, and list all the amenities that I can see, and two, I think that are important and relevant. But that doesn't mean that I'm, noticing an amenity or every amenity that is actually important to the type of, guest that will stay at my property. Because for example, one of the things that me and my wife always look for is when we stay at an Airbnb property is, does it have a shower that's separate? Not, a shower in a bathtub with like a shower screen or something, like a curtain, but we want a separate shower. We don't care even if it doesn't have the bath, but we want a separate shower. And there's sometimes where it's not in the description, but based on the images, we can see it has a separate shower. Clearly the host either forgot or didn't, deem it worthwhile to mention, because they thought, okay, I mentioned the fact that he has a bath. For example, he might have a separate bath, or he has, showering facilities. So I think that there'll be that as well, because what people are looking for in a big city flat versus a cabin in the woods are going to be totally different. There are going to be certain amenities that, like in a city flat, like in London or New York, I doubt they're looking for an electric charger. Whereas, for the car. Whereas if you're living somewhere or staying somewhere where there's a lot more space, you can park your car, especially if it's out in the, out of the way somewhere. As EVs become more popular, that might be a very popular thing for that particular location, and you'll flag it up. You'll say, okay, this is a thing, and we'll sort of, say these are the top five amenities, even though the host may not consider them important, but they are for the type of guest they're going to attract.
Yeah, I think that that kind of goes back to, what the challenge of building um, a platform like Airbnb and a sharing economy is like every customer is very different. So what the host thinks is important, a lot of the time customers might not care, and vice
Mm.
versa, right? Like, you care, a customer has many different needs, and the host might be like, oh, okay. Just because every stay is very personalized, and every traveling couple or family or a single person is so different. What they look for in a room is very different from what the host would know, because they don't have that information of what customers will actually book your room, right? And so I think that's one of the main challenges, I would say, is to build the best intuitive experience for many, many, many different personas. And that's kind of like the challenge that we still run into.
Oh yeah, I think it's coming. It's one of those ongoing challenges. But yeah, like having it. So if I go on a particular, listing versus you going on the same one, if Airbnb knows that you're more interested in having a TV, like that's the thing that you're always looking for, and that's the amenity that you're always selecting, versus me that's always looking for a jacuzzi, for example. Even though the property might have a jacuzzi and a TV, for you scrolling, it might show you a certain image first. Maybe if it's a nice TV or a cinema room, and maybe if they got a nice jacuzzi or hot tub or something like that, they'll show me those images first or highlight it in the listing. So I think having the listing, catered towards the guest, even though the actual, the amenities are the same, but having it catered is definitely going to be very powerful. So, because you know how, like on Netflix, the thumbnail is different for different users depending on the sort of movies and TV shows they like to watch. If somebody prefers something more actiony, they'll try and get a more intense thumbnail, versus if somebody prefers more relaxed and more comical content to watch, they'll try and get something a bit more low beat, that'll attract them. So having it unique like that is definitely something, and I think AI models can really help with that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I agree with you. Having a more personalized experience on the platform would be really good for the customers. Another challenge that I just thought about as well, as you're talking, is that on Airbnb, a lot of the times you would book for guests. So, for example, like you say, you and your boys went on a trip to a different Airbnb, and now you have multiple guests who have probably different preferences. But let's say you book it and you have that information that maybe Airbnb can personalize for you, but it's very personalized to you, right? Versus personalized to a group of guests that might have different preferences, and I think that is the it just adds the complexity to personalization, right? Because a lot of times it's not like hotels where you probably just book for yourself and maybe one other person. Airbnb is usually a bigger group, or it could be just yourself as well. There's many different use cases that you have to think about.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I know on Airbnb right now you can add like other users to a particular booking. I think that's good so they can, obviously see the booking details, if there's any sort of checking details, especially if they're coming separately, not with you in their own car, for example. So if there's specific directions, which, you find with Air, that's the one thing with Airbnb is compared to hotels, you don't know what the, directions are going to be, until you get there, sometimes it can make for some interesting stories definitely compared to a hotel. But yeah, like having the ability to add other Airbnb users, so let's say other people are staying with you, onto it. But I think that'll what would be fantastic is if you could, let's say if you're going to do a big holiday and you're doing it with your boys and there's 4 or 5 of you, if you could create some sort of like planning or like trip or journey or something, add all of everyone, assuming they're on Airbnb, and that's a good way of inviting them and getting more users if they're not, because you can invite them via email, and they're going to want to register just so they can be involved and see the information. But then they can select, like you said, different things. Like one person might really want a double bed. One person might really want that, walk-in shower. One person might want this. Have these things selected, and then based on that information, the results that, let's say when you're searching for something, let's say if you're searching for a place to stay in London, you could say for this particular trip, like the boys weekend trip, and you say, okay, everyone put these parameters, let's sort of tailor it or filter it for those parameters, because otherwise we're just filtering it for this particular individual who searched for it, who might say, I want a cabin, or I want, all filters that you get at the top. There's cabin, there's tiny homes, there's futuristic, those sort of stuff. So it's not very trip and journey specific. So I think that'll be, really cool and really useful as well when you can, collaboratively do it together. Because sometimes what ends up happening is you either get in the same room with your friends, or you meet up or you jump on a call to try and figure it out. Whereas if you can do it in your own time and add your own contributions, and if you can do that without even having to select boxes, if you can just type it out, I mean, that would be fantastic. Because one of my businesses is with a bank called, it's a new sort of modern challenger bank called Anna. And it's just it's just a new banking platform, and they have the typical phone interface where you can click on buttons, but they have a chat system where you can type in what you want to do. So you could say send money, so, send $10 from this account to this account, and you'll populate the data, and you'll say okay, you're missing a reference. Do you want to put a reference? You say yes or no. Instead of having to press buttons, it's basically talking to you. That'll probably be using some sort of AI chat based model as well. But imagine that for Airbnb, where you can talk to it what you're actually looking for. I think that'll be really really powerful as well.
Yeah, so I actually recently looked at what ChatGPT had. It actually had a plugin for Kayak. So Kayak
Okay.
has a plugin where you basically, when you chat with it, you could be like, "Hey, I'm looking for these type of hotel rooms, from this price range to this price range," and then the Kayak plugin will basically give you recommendations on you know, what hotel rooms that, or what hotels or what rental cars that you might want to book. And then it does the filtering, but it's more of a conversation versus the typical experience right now is you have a bunch of filters on the top, you add a bunch of filters, and then the recommended results would pop out into a list, and then you kind of book whatever is available. Um, yeah, I think that's a very cool concept. I would say I tried it. It's very experimental still, but like I don't have the confidence to book anything through ChatGPT yet. I think maybe down the line. But right now, I do think that's like a pretty interesting use case. Yeah,
Oh yeah, for sure. Obviously, ChatGPT does have a bunch of plugins, but it's very early days. There's a lot of potential there if you're a developer or just in general to as a customer to utilize it. 'Cause like I said, I use ChatGPT all the time, and it hasn't been that long since I've been using it. Probably couple of months maximum,
hmm
and I can't see myself not going back and using it. It's like something like that. And Google is is crazy. Is the secondary thing that I use if there's something I can't get, or I know that okay, I'll definitely be able to get quicker on Google because if I'm googling something and I know I want a specific link. And Google's just my easy go-to way of doing it. But when it's something unknown and I want information, I don't want to have to be clicking links if I don't have to. So I think, yeah, ChatGPT and other AI models, definitely exciting times. So, for engineers or aspiring engineers that are listening and want to build a career in engineering, especially in companies like Airbnb, sharing economies, what like specific skills and experiences should they be focused on acquiring? What technologies, what advice would you give to them?
yeah. So my advice for aspiring developers who are in school, I would say, is to don't focus on languages or frameworks. Focus on thinking like a engineer, a software engineer. So that means to really like participate in hackathons, participate in different side projects that might not even need to be super successful in society standards, but just build a lot of things, right? It could, hackathon is a good way. You can do it on the side. You could also maybe, find a client online and then offer them to build something for them for very cheap or for free. Um, that really develops a lot of your skills in terms of building something from scratch, and to really just and based on that journey, figuring out what framework to use. That's also a skill to have, right? Because all these side projects might have different use cases. Different use cases will have different language preferences or frameworks, and based on that, you would learn a lot. Just kind of all broad. You'll be a very um, generalist software engineer, and then and from that you can then determine where you want to focus on more. Do you want to focus on front end engineering? You want to focus on mainly APIs and backend, or do you want to do more infrastructure related? Or you could say, hey, I want to be more of a data scientist, right? I want to focus more on analyzing the data. I don't really care about, building the product from scratch, right? So I think that is kind of my advice for aspiring developers and for engineers who are already in industry, and want to transition into, you know, a bigger company. I would say just, focus on the algorithms, system design thinking, right? There's a lot of cool engineering blogs online that you can focus on. Um, Basically, like all big companies would have a tech blog, like LinkedIn, Airbnb, Meta. These companies all have engineering blogs that you could take a look at to see, like, here's how they solve very complex problems at very big companies. And then they will usually have a really good write up. So I would say read. those papers to understand the system design in the real world, right? In terms of like advice to kind of just generally to both um, aspiring developers or engineers who are working, I would say is to focus on, I would say focus on the business side of things as well. A lot of time, engineering, you focus a lot too much on the actual, building using the coolest technology and building like fun and cool projects. Those are obviously something that's very important. But when I started working, I learned a lot about like a lot of times there's, what is the engineering project? What business impact is it going to provide? Right. So like right now I'm working on focusing on growth. So like the business impact is like increasing first time bookers or increasing um, more visits to the website, things like that. You want to build the engineering project that would impact the business metrics. And I think that's a really hard balance to do. And so I would say that's kind of my advice is to focus on business impact as well, but also on the engineering roadmap of what your engineering team is trying to do. And hopefully those two align. If those two align, that's perfect. If not, then you would have to make some trade-offs.
Yeah, I mean, there's always some sort of trade off you're making. I mean, with life in general, but if you're looking, talking more specifically engineering programming, there's always that thing like, are you gonna build fast? But then if you're building fast, things won't work as well as they could, do that. That's just inevitable. They won't be as polished. You might create stuff that the users just don't want. But then if you wait too long, you might become irrelevant as well. So there's always some sort of trade off. We've been talking about engineering for a bit for a fair bit now. But what actually attracted you to the field of engineering, and more specifically, software engineering?
Yeah. What attracted me the most is I've always been a builder, I would say. I've always liked to, try new things. And I like to, every time I would say a lot of my college friends, when I were hanging out with them in college, they would always joke that like I'm always the first one to download an app, to test it out, to create an account. Um, a lot of new, apps out there like Uber, Lyft, things like that. I was kind of the first one in my friend group to try it. I've always, Airbnb, I was also a very early user. I just always been, you know, the one who enjoys emerging technologies, but also on the other hand loves like building. Um, I've considered different types of engineering. When I was in university, I kind of stumbled upon computer science just because I took a intro class and I thought it was very difficult. It wasn't natural to me, I would say, the way how, programming languages work. It wasn't very natural to me. But I just enjoyed like, I remember the first project that I had to do was like build a game, like in Python or something. The game was like the snake game that everyone's familiar with. And I remember like I just couldn't figure it out. But then once I built it and it actually worked, I was like
Snake's not the easiest game to make.
I
To
mean,
be
it's
fair.
not easy. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
It is.
like,
It's one of those things that people might look at because it's an old game now, and it's been on the old Nokia phone. And they look at it and be like, "Yeah, it's an easy one." There's some older games that if you're just a solo developer, they're not that easy. Like Pong's easy, Pac-Man
yeah,
not so easy, especially if you're doing the AI as well. You're doing it properly. What else? Tetris is pretty complicated if you do that properly, and you want to make it so it's extendable with the different types of blocks as well. And obviously, Snake's difficult. What sort of snake did you do? Did you do Snake 1 or 2, where could your snake pass through the walls or not?
No, 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 no. There was
The,
restriction.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
imagine
See,
having to do that where your snake
yeah,
could be halfway, especially when the snake gets long and they could be all over the place.
right. Yeah, yeah. They can like wrap around when they touch themselves, they'll
Yes.
die. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't an easy one. But I remember just like the sense of accomplishment that I had when I built it, and then I started like getting fascinated with like honestly just uh, once I that was kind of the stepping stone, and then eventually I actually interned at a digital agency in Chicago called One North Interactive, and that was like the first time that like we were building website for clients. I did it for one summer, and I just thought it was really cool that like these clients basically reached out to us to build kind of outsource the websites that they wanted. And then I was kind of introduced that into that these projects that the clients were basically asking us for. And then I never looked back. I always been, building, um, doing things on the side, things like that.
Okay. So, as an engineer, what are, especially when you're working at a company like Hotel Tonight or, Airbnb, where there's, customer data, a lot of customer data at hand from, their addresses, emails, payment data as well. Like, how do you prioritize the user experience without compromising the security and privacy of Airbnb users? Because I know as an engineer myself, there are times where if let go of certain security practices, you can make the user experience better. But then it's like, it's that trade off. Where do you, draw the lines? Like, so how do you handle those sort of situations?
Yeah. So at Airbnb and Hotel Tonight, security and privacy is probably the most important. Like nothing else. Like the trade off is very like the security and privacy is like number one. Like that's uh there's no you cannot sacrifice that at all. And it's just because it's a company that is built on trust. And so if you kind of make the trade off to help the customer in other ways, but you sacrifice the security and privacy, you know the company's getting big trouble legally in the U.S. Or just like in the world as well. So we basically follow the best security practices and also the best privacy practices. We have like top-notch security experts on the team and also legal experts on the team that would, basically provide us the guidelines to these best practices. And every product that we launch is, it gets reviewed by security team and the legal team to make sure that like we do not sacrifice or like we do not violate any privacy concerns or also like security malpractice. So that is kind of what I mean personally when I work on personal projects or like side projects or like projects in school. If the not that many customers, like then when you build the engineering system, you focus less on the security and the privacy just because you don't have that many customers. You basically build features to initially get customers, right? But at this stage of Airbnb, it's so big and it's built on trust. Like um, there's no sacrifice. It's probably the most important thing that Airbnb focuses on.
Okay. So, like, what sort of specific Because we've been talking about Airbnb, we're talking about Hotel Tonight. Like, what sort of specific features and projects have you worked on at those companies that if somebody goes onto the platforms, they can look and be like, oh, that's what Ted Wu did, or that's what Ted Wu was part of. Because obviously, these website platforms, they're very big. Obviously, there's certain features projects that you would have specifically worked on, and that's your handiwork. That's there.
Yeah. So I can kind of pick one project from each company. So for Hotel Tonight, one of the features that I built is actually one of probably first product that I built, um, that, that's consumer facing, was upgrades. So back in, I think it was 3 to 4 years ago, um, Hotel Tonight, there are no like upgrades. So there's no like upgrade rooms. There's no rooms that that's not a possibility. But then I built the suite upgrade product. So basically, it allows a customer to do an add-on. So then, like, let's say you want, a normal standard room, but for $15 extra, you can book their, a room that is upgraded. It's usually like, nicer windows, a higher floor, it's quieter, things like that, or bigger space. So that's kind of like the first, you know, consumer facing product that I built. Because you also have to build like that from the hotel side. So the tooling on the hotel side, you need to allow hotels to kind of allocate upgrade rooms and set the upgrade pricing, and then figuring out the demand of these upgrade rooms, because if it's the demand is too low, they can bump up the upgrade rooms, or if the pricing is too high, there's a little balance that you want to do for hotels. So I also built that as well. um, and on the Airbnb side, I it's not consumer facing, but I worked on the um, so basically there's a we call pro host. So pro host is basically a host that has a lot of properties. So I was on that team working on, the calendar side and the pricing side. So it allows a pro host to manage multiple properties and their availability across multiple properties. So they could like, I will open up July for property one, two, and three, and then I'm gonna set these type of pricing. So building the tooling for that the is what I worked on, and we built a lot of different features to help pro hosts to make it easier for them to manage across multiple properties. Another one that I'm pretty proud of is the demand heat map on the pro host side. So you could like the host could figure out what nights will have higher demand so they can adjust the pricing. They could figure out what days have lower demand, and then they can, maybe lower the price or give like some sort of discount, if you book in on low demand days. So those are the two projects that I'm really proud of in terms of the consumer facing ones. And I worked on, I mean, I've been at the company for 4 years, almost five. And I built a lot of different other features that are more behind the scenes. But it's still, um, yeah, it's still pretty exciting.
So these whole platforms like Airbnb, Hotel Tonight, must be very data driven. Data analytics, machine learning. That must play a huge part of the platform and the development and improvement of the platform as well. So what are some of the examples that how these technologies are utilized to improve the platform? Like what sort of specifics have come from collecting data, machine learning, and like what new features have come about, not because some designer or some manager sat in a room and said let's do this, but from the data that may have been contrary to what a manager said, but the data was saying we need to do this or we need to remove this from the platforms.
Yeah, so that's a really good example. I actually do this a lot in the past year. So figuring out like, but every decision you make has to be data driven, right? You need to have the data to back it up versus like top down, like this is what we need to do. Um, it's the culture at Airbnb is not like that. The culture at Airbnb is more like, okay, you really need to focus on, what problem you're trying to solve, and from that problem, what you're trying to solve, you need to look at the analytics, the data to basically say, this is the problem. And then the solution would always be like, here are some of our hypotheses, and let's run an experiment. to make sure that it validates our hypothesis or it invalidates it, right? So if it, once you set up the experiment, if a candidate group underperforms the control group, we would just, even though we invested time and resources into the product, we would not launch it because we know that like the data has shown that it either hurts conversion or it would, increase time to booking, things like that. There's a bunch of primary metrics that we look at that would basically summarize the customer experience. Um, and so, yeah, so there's some, let me think about some features that in the past are driven by um, data. Let me think. Yeah, so an example would be um, we have, you know, we look into some data and then we look. So this is like more on the trust and safety side, like um, identifying fraud. But we looked at like, okay, what is the effectiveness of phone verification, right? Because we have, I'm sure you get this all the time. Like you sign in and then they say, hey, we sent you a code. Can you verify the code? And then only if you verify, we will log you in. This is a very interesting feature because it impacts conversion because like it's an additional friction step that is included into the funnel and the booking funnel, right? And so, but the trade-off is that, with phone verification, it's harder for someone who's trying to, you know, do fraud because they do not own the device that you have. They don't have your phone. So then when you do a phone verification, let's say you get a code randomly saying that you want to book, um, and it's you didn't make that booking, then you can like contact support and basically say, hey, like someone is trying to, defraud my account. So like there was a lot of data analysis behind that, right? Because it's like, okay, how do we determine whether how do we do phone verification to some of our users who we think are fraudsters and try to limit phone verification to good customers. Because if you're a good customer, let's say I'm a repeat, like I'm a booker that books multiple times and suddenly start throwing me phone verification every time, I'm gonna
That's
be
so
annoyed.
annoying. It's so
It
annoying
is.
when you know you're a legit customer.
Yeah,
It could be
exactly.
anything. It doesn't have to be phone verification. It could be, but like there's some extra step that gets put in, or they're like, we need to verify this, and I'm like, and you think you've never had to do it before, and you're doing it with me now on a platform that's not new to me. It is so annoying, and like there's moments that you just want to go off it, off that platform because you're like you feel like you take it personally, even though it is just a computer making the decisions. It's not a human sitting there saying, "I don't like the look of this guy. Let me get him to do extra verification." But you do take it personally. You think, I'm always on your platform. I'm always, especially if there's money involved. I'm always giving you money, and now you're asking for me to verify. And then when you try and verify, the verification doesn't work. That makes you even more annoyed.
Yeah, exactly. So that's like a perfect example of, for first time bookers, that's gonna be not a good experience. But then for a customer that are or who for actual fraudsters who are actually going to hurt the bottom line of the business, you want to use phone verification to catch them, right? So the data that we've been looking at is mostly just like we have all the data on verification results. We have like, let's say a fraudster bypasses phone verification. We have all these data in the back end and analytics, and then we keep on feeding the model all basically what happened, right? So it could be like this good customer passed phone verification, and in the future we wouldn't ask for phone verification unless there's some sort of change in behavior, and the model thinks otherwise, right? And obviously it's controlled by all the data that we have. But this is a really good example of like using analytics and data science to figure out what feature to build, and once you build it, figure out the effectiveness of that feature but also the kind of the con of basically the impact of when you launch that feature, because you always have like metrics that you measure. You always have, the pros that a feature has, but there's always a con as well. It's pretty rare that you would launch a feature and then it's everything, all the metrics are positive. It's usually not the case. And in this example for phone verification, the primary metric that was really good was, there was a lot less fraud, a lot less chargebacks, a lot less refunds. But then the con is that, the time to booking is higher because you have to require phone verification. There's also more customer support contacts. Like, these are all the things that, all the metrics that we care about. And then every time you launch a feature, you can determine whether it's successful or not based on these numbers.
So obviously, when you're building these platforms, it's never a solo endeavor. It's a very collaborative, innovative, approach. And like, how does Airbnb Hotel Tonight and you personally try and cultivate that in the teams, that culture of collaboration, of innovation, but without it becoming too much red tape and bureaucracy, because when you're doing stuff as a solo developer, whether you're an entrepreneur and you've got no one else with you or maybe one or two other people, or you're just within a company, within a team, but you just got your own your tasks, you've got your own user stories and you're going through them, like how do you make sure that things still progress even when you're working with other people, and how do you enhance that? Like, are there any particular tools, any methodologies, philosophies that you use?
Yeah, so I would say, so right now I'm leading the growth team at Hotel Tonight, and my philosophy around leadership, it's not that you want to be in charge, you want to make all the decisions, right? For me, leadership is a form of being empathetic and servicing to your team. And my goal as a leader is to just always, unlock the best in others, especially people on my team, through mentorship, through coaching, or just, pair programming sometimes as well. My own mentors, I have a lot of mentors in my career, and they played a really big part in, you know, getting to where I am today. And now I basically want to kind of contribute to that so that we can have a collaborative team environment. One of the methodologies that I use is that it's, instead of top down, it's very bottoms up. So I would, every quarter, we would have a meeting, and we basically would just have like people from different functions, product, customer service, engineering, all come up with ideas of how to improve growth. And then based on these brainstorming sessions, we would then use these ideas, and then we'll kind of do investigation on whether that would work. So we'll do some exploration phase. And a lot of these projects that we launched in the past year have came from these brainstorming sessions. And it came from ideas that are, came from people who are very close to the problem. And I think that's the beauty of having that collaborative culture, and also just like calling out good ideas, even though if it's not really from your team, and then you give credit to where credit's due. So yeah, so that's kind of what my philosophy is. And I, in the future, like right now, I've mostly been IC my whole career, and this is more of a transition into leading teams. And in the longer term, I definitely want to be an engineering manager, so I can have, continue to build that culture within the engineering team. But also, I do really enjoy the responsibilities that I have right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point that you made about giving credit where credit's due, because that's something that when you're it's not even the tech industry or the engineering sort of field that is unique to. It's I mean, I haven't been a doctor, but I'm sure if you was a doctor, it'd be the same. I'm sure if you're just working at a supermarket, it'll be the same. It's more just human nature. But especially if you're in this industry, when you've got managers, when you got senior developers, especially when you're like starting out, you're more of a junior. You're a bit scared of speaking. Up. You don't have the sort of voice that you might in 5, 10, 15 years. You will get people that will take credit for the work you've done, and it might not be as direct as saying, "Oh, I implemented this feature." It may just be them not mentioning you. It might be like, your team is working on some, or a particular project, and your instrumental, your main, your task to a particular part of that project, and your manager reports that to their manager, maybe one of the C-suite executives, and they like it, and your manager takes the credit because it is his team. But you might feel disheartened and angry that he hasn't said, "Oh, Ted was the one that was responsible for this particular feature, and he did a really good job at it." So that's something that I think, I mean, anyone at any level, but when you're starting out, you will have to deal with, you will have to, overcome. But what I will say is, a good manager, obviously, they should ideally give credit where credit's due, but it's not always practical to be constantly mentioning, it was Ted that implemented this, it was Farhan that did this, especially if you're doing, always doing small different projects, and if that manager might be busy, and they might only have the CEO's ear for half an hour a week. Him spending 10 minutes explaining that Ted improved the search functionality might not always be the best use of his time. But also, likewise, when shit hits the fan and things are going wrong, then if your manager is protecting you, as long as you haven't done anything really badly, and let's say you didn't do it on purpose and it wasn't due to neglect or anything, but like something goes wrong, if they take the brunt of the negative side from the his managers, and they protect you, then that yes, you may not always get credit for things, but yes, you are also protected as well. And I think it's when you have that, I think it's a good balance. Like I know I've seen it where I remember ages ago when I was on a placement at Accenture, I was at 3 different projects there, and it was very easy for people just to throw other people under the bus, over anything. But I remember when I was at one project, my man, it wasn't even something that went wrong. It was just the other part of the team who was basically in charge of talking to the stakeholders, talking to the other people involved about what features they're going to implement. They weren't technical. They tried to creep in some extra features, in this, what you would call a sprint. Now, they weren't doing sprints, but basically within this little time frame. And even though I was happy to do it, and it wasn't even that complex to do it, my manager stepped right in and said, "No, he's not doing that. We're not doing that because you haven't properly created a task for it. You've just thrown it in there, and if we rush it there and it's not properly tested, you're going to blame him. So go through the proper procedure, give the proper time to carry out that task, and then you'll get it done, but it might not be done straight away." And my manager used to be a programmer, so there's definitely merit when they're from the engineering field. So having a manager like that definitely helps.
Yeah, I think kind of what you said earlier too. When I said like give credit to where credit is due, a lot of one good way is to do shout outs. So you send an email every time you have a product launch and you shout out to whoever contributed to the project. And I think that is a good way to obviously not, you don't have to dig deep into what everyone did, but it's a really good shout out to like specific teams that helped you out or specific individuals that helped you out. And that's usually a really good way to build that like collaboration culture, because then people are more willing to help you out in the future. If you're if you help them out, sometimes they'll help you out back. That's kind of like the idea. That's like, it's not like Obviously, there's selfishly every team has goals that they need to reach, and other teams also have their own concerns and resourcing. But once we understand that we're all in the same company, the same unit, so we have a goal, like an upfront goal as a company, then that collaboration culture will continue to happen, versus like, once the competitiveness comes out, then that's kind of where a lot of the problems come. If there's like egos within each team, it's the management of these egos, I think, that is the the hard part to do. But once it's managed, then it's, you know you maintain that culture once egos are managed.
Oh yeah, it's just setting up that that precedent, the standards, from the start, and then managing it isn't too much of an issue. But I do like that idea of giving people their credit when it's due, but doing it in a way where you're sending it, like say, when a new product is launched, or whether let's say internally, a release has been, gone through testing phase, and it's all been verified. If not released yet, give credit that way, because it means that you're not under pressure to do it on a call, for example, where you might have other things to talk about or other things to think about. Like if you literally, as a manager, set aside, so let's say if you're doing a sprint based approach, let's say 2-3 weeks per sprint, and then at the end of the sprint, if you set aside an hour or half an hour of your time, and I think this will be very productive for the motivation and then ultimately the output of your team, to make a note of, okay, this person did this task, this person did this task got complete, it got put into the next version, and this version is going to get released here. Mention those things, like I said, just on an email, just say, Ted worked on improving the search, and that is due to be coming out in version 2.7.4 of the app. And Frahan worked on this person worked on this, and then maybe people don't get mentioned because maybe they haven't completed some work, but maybe it's a large piece of work that might take 3-4 sprints, for example. More than, even though managers and CEOs and board members would definitely like everything to be completed in each sprint and for you not to overrun, but that's not the case. But mention that, okay, Bob is working on this feature and it's going to be great, and that we should hopefully have it ready in a month. That's another way of giving credit or acknowledging people's work even when the work's not complete yet. And I think that's very, very powerful for managers to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So are there any sort of engineering principles and philosophies that guide your approach to problem solving and developing in general?
um so I would say, the obviously there's very basic, like, engineering principles that you want to focus on, and then you have like best practices. And these, I would say, best practices is the one, like, initially when you first start as a junior developer, you wouldn't really know what is the best practice, right? So you get that information from usually code reviews from senior developers or more senior managers to understand like what is the right way to do things. But I would say the documentation of best practice is also really important, and also having the engineering culture to to maintain these principles is very important as well. An example would be, you a lot of times when you have a deadline coming up, what do you sacrifice usually? It's like, you can get into bad habit of like, okay, let's just build it in a very hacky way. Let's not follow best practices, but you do launch the feature, right? So that's like a really tricky position, because you're like close to the deadline. You don't want to delay the deadline, things like that. But a good culture would say, hey, let's plan this project to follow best practices, but because we're following best practices, we're gonna increase the short term duration of the project. So short term, we will sacrifice maybe 2 to 3 weeks, extra weeks. But in the future, by following these best practices, we actually reduce technical debt. We can move faster in the future. We can have a lot, you know, less burden as we, kind of add more code on top of the code base that we already have. That kind of is like the culture that like engineering managers specifically, but also just like technical leads have to defend, right? A lot of times you have the product team that, has a deadline, or they want to push out features by this quarter, by the end of the quarter, or like by Labor Day weekend, things like that. But you need to, as engineering leaders, push back on these demands, because once you push back once, or once you don't push back, and once you let it slip one time, it's going to continue to slip. And then once it continues to slip, these best practices don't get implemented. So I was thinking that that's my philosophy, is like the maintaining that culture, but also just having the documentation of, what are the best practices, and then having the desire as a team to defend that these best practices.
Oh yeah, for sure. And one of the things, when we're talking about best practices, the documentation is, documenting in general. Because as engineers, and I'm sure you've seen this, or probably even been guilty for it. I know I have. When you're coding, you don't want to comment. You want to just quickly get the code finished. You don't want to document it. You don't want to write this documentation or this, guide for it, and you see it as sometimes either a waste of time or taken away from your core work. And it should be part of that core work, just as once you've programmed, testing, it should be part of it. Obviously you'll have different types of testing, boundary testing, black box, white box testing, user test, all sorts of different types of testing. And obviously what you're working on will you know determine the type of testing that's best. But spending that time to structure your code well, document it, create the comment it, create the documentation, maybe some with some step-by-step guides with screenshots, maybe video guides as well. I think that will yield a lot of benefits to you and the team and your company, and I think that's something your managers will notice. And to make it so that you and the rest of the team know that it's important to do those things, to spend that time in creating that documentation, and then following though that documentation. And the obviously it might be best practices, it might be coding standards, it might be how to set something up, whatever it is. Make sure that you do spend that time outside of what you think your core you know work is. Because let's say if you're an athlete and you think your core work is, let's say if you're you want to go to the Olympics and you want to do the 100-meter sprint. Yes, you've got to run obviously, but if you're constantly just running, you're going to get tired. Like, you're not going to let your body recover. So you need to do those things. Then you need to do the diet aspect. Then you'll probably need to do some mental exercise as well. There's so many things outside of the 100-meter physical run that have to be on point, and that have to just line up as well for you to be able to win. That just doing running is not enough. And that's the same thing with engineering. Just coding or engineering is not enough. You need to document. You need to obviously be collaborative. And even if you don't necessarily need to, always collaborate, interact with your colleagues, because there may come a time where you really need something, and there's a particular colleague that can get to you. If you're never interacting with this colleague ever, and you've been there for 2 years, and you just suddenly message them on Teams or Slack, for example, and say,
Mhm.
I need this, like, in the back of their minds, they're gonna be like, this guy's never messaged me before, and now he's requesting this off me. How dare he? Even though you might be well within your right, if you establish that relationship beforehand, that'll go a long way. So work on the core things, but work on the secondary things as well, because when you need it, whether that's documentation or relationships, you'll be happy that you spent that time on it.
Hmm. Definitely.
So, throughout your journey so far, what's been your biggest regret? And, what lessons have you learned? And, on top of that, would you advise people, to go to university to be able to get a job in the engineering field like you have?
Hmm. Yeah. So I think regrets. I mean, I don't really have too many like big regrets in my career, but I would say one thing that I would change, knowing what I know now compared to before, is I think a lot of engineers have imposter syndrome. So basically thinking that, do you deserve to be there? Like a lot of, especially when you're starting off, like you look at a person and you're like, okay, they're senior engineers that have 10 years of experience. They must know like a lot more than you. Generally, that is true. They have more experience, but I would say, in the software engineering field, everyone is learning new things every day. If you're not, then that's not good. Because things change. There's always new things that come up. There's new challenges, and you having an imposter syndrome basically saying like, hey, you don't like you feel like you don't belong in the team because you don't know as much. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think it's a lot of times when people come in with fresh eyes, especially a new engineer from a different company, come in with fresh eyes, they would be like, oh, why do we do the way we do? Like, why do we do it this way? And even just posing that question and asking questions is helpful, and it allows, the team to evolve, and it's very beneficial. So I think one of the regrets I had, maybe the first 2 3 years of my career is always feeling like, oh, I don't know enough. Like, do I deserve to be here? Like, I kind of just feel like, I don't belong. But then I realized like that's a lot of people feel that way. And it's it's up to the team to kind of come up with a culture where you incorporate someone who might feel that way, but also that's kind of like how I got incorporated into it. Is I started being more confident, asking more questions, and then back in the day I would feel like asking question might not look good on you because you want to be the person who knows a lot. But then I realized like the people who knows the most are the ones who ask the most questions in code reviews, in team meetings, in system architecture design meetings. Those are those people who know the most are the ones who ask the most questions. And the questions can be basic, but it can challenge an assumption. So that's my biggest regret, is to but I mean I still think it's a good learning experience. And the second part to your question is, would I recommend people going to university to study computer science? I would say it really depends on what you want to do to achieve your goals. So like if you want to be a pure programmer, right? There's ways to go around university to become a software engineer. So you could do a boot camp, you can self learn. There's a lot of online resources that will teach you coding. But I would say on the other side, the pros of going to university, a lot of them is the intangibles, right? So you meet a lot of people from different backgrounds. You not only will take engineering classes, you usually in the university will ask you to take other classes that would broaden your experience and your mindset. And the connections that you make at university are very valuable. Like I still, I work with people that I went to school with, just like previously. And or I there's a lot of connections when you want to go to a new company, you can ask them to refer you. You can basically have that network of friends kind of even after university is very beneficial to your career, but also beneficial to your own physical and mental health. Um, so yeah, so it really depends on what you're optimizing for.
Oh yeah, definitely. You need to figure out, what you want, and I think engineering and especially programming is one of those fields. Yes, you can go to university, get your comp sci degree, but you, like I say, you can do a boot camp. You can self learn on YouTube, Code Academy, Udemy, Udacity. Like there's so many platforms out there that you can get the skills. Yes, when you gain your first job, it may be a bit more difficult because they still, no matter what people say, there's still weight that the to having a degree. Be like, oh, he's got a degree in computer science and he got a good grade, and on top of that, if you end up going to a good university as well, it's like you can't say that if somebody goes to Harvard, for example, and they're in the interview, that somebody's not going to be like, oh, he went to Harvard. Or in the UK, if they went to Oxford, like it's still knocks you back or knocks other people back when you've gone to a good university or university in general. But it doesn't mean that you can't do it without going, especially if you're a little older. Because obviously the cost of university. Because like Ted, what do they cost in the US to get through a comp sci degree? Like at Northwestern University, for example.
Yeah.
Like how
So
much did would it cost you?
so private university costs like tuition is probably like 30 to 40,000 a year.
A year, and that's just a tuition. That's
That's
not accommodation or food or
yeah.
books, is it?
Accommodation now, I think I looked it up like last year is like at least Northwestern is like 60 to 70,000 including everything per year.
So
And
okay, so everything, so tuition, accommodation, and like a bit of extra spending money to get some
yeah.
stuff, to
And
live
then
and get books and whatnot. About
yeah.
60,000 to 70,000 US dollars a year. Then
Yeah, which is like
Jesus, that's a
insane
lot.
amount. I mean, even like public universities are cheaper if you're in state, but it's still in the range of like 30,000, 40,000. So it's still a lot of money
Yeah.
um, per year, especially if you, you know, let's say you studied a different major in university and you want to kind of pick up computer science, you could either do masters for 2 years or you could yeah, learn online, try to I would say like using your connections, cold emailing, cold LinkedIn to like reach out to people and then like build side projects to showcase your talent. And then eventually you can switch to a new maybe, join a startup first and because usually startups are willing to take a chance. And then you get the experience that you need, and then you go to you keep applying. I think it's difficult because I can't really speak on it because I had a computer science degree. So my recruiting process is pretty standard,
Hmm.
but it was even though I had a computer science degree. When I applied for my first internship, I think I applied like 200 places, and then I only heard back from a few. Just because interns, a lot of companies like they need to train you, they a lot of hand holding, and then you might not even come back. So there's a lot of resourcing upfront to help an intern. But once you have that chance, then you can continue to grow your career.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's something that people definitely don't appreciate is the amount of effort. If a company does it well, properly with an intern, is how much they'll put in. It's the same sort of effort they're putting into getting like a full time employee, and you're probably, especially if you're doing it whilst you're at university or just after, it'll be the same sort of work that you're doing. It's just obviously, for a lot less pay. Where did you do your internship? What company?
So I interned at so in Chicago I interned at One Earth Interactive, which is a digital creative agency. But then afterwards, I interned my junior year. I interned at Chartboost. and then for full time I went back. So I was one of those interns who went back to the same company. So they extended me a full time offer after my internship, and then obviously I liked the team, I liked the culture, I liked the people. It was a really good learning opportunity for me to join a startup, so I went back for full time.
Yeah, and obviously in that case, for them it worked out because they trained you. They obviously gave you an offer, and they could even them liking you and giving you an offer. That's just the first stage from the employer's perspective. You've got to accept it. You could easily think, I didn't like it, or I can get, go somewhere else. I can go Uber, I can go Google, or you want to take a break or whatever it is. So yeah, there's a lot of risk for a company as well. Something that people don't, think about. So, in terms of like, that's all my specific questions around your career. Uh, Before we wrap up, I always have a few fun, generic, quickfire questions.
Yeah, go for
And
it.
so the first one, like, would you, if you was to run your own company, would you rather run a 10-person company or a 1,000-person company, and why?
You said 10-person company or
One
or
thousand,
one
10 or
thousand?
1,000.
I would say I would rather, if I were to start a company today, I would rather do 10 people company.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just because I've always been really into the kind of growing it from a ground up type of feeling, like scrappiness. You start from uh, under resourcing, and then you try to come up with creative solutions to problems. That's kind of what I would do right now. And then hopefully eventually that company grows to 1,000. But I wouldn't. That's what I prefer, at least.
Okay. So, would you rather have 5 million US dollars up front or 500,000 a year for the rest of your life, and why?
Yeah. So for me, I would rather have 500,000 a year. Um, Financially, I think that makes sense, and also just like you can use, you know, 500,000 for the rest of my life, right? So I would say I'll pick that because with 500,000, then I can invest in a lot of my health, physical health, mental health, and then from that, I'll definitely get a lot more than 5 million. And I think that like a lot of projects can be bootstrapped under half a million, even $10,000. You could bootstrap a lot of ideas that you want. You could build
Yeah,
prototypes.
you can. Like 10, $20,000 can go a long way, but 500,000 can get spent very easily if you don't watch the pennies. Like, it's one of those things. It's crazy how far you can get with very little, but it's also crazy how much can get wasted if you don't watch it. I've seen people raise 500,000 or $1 million, and within a year or two it's gone, and like their startup is just dead. And it's crazy. Like, before that they were bootstrapping it, and they was taking no salary and no nothing, and they made more progress, before they even raised the money. Like, you would think they've done the hard part now, but they fail.
Yeah, I think the being frugal, right, is a very big trait in, both in company but also just in personal life. I've always been a huge advocate on like living below your means. Um, just buying things that you actually need versus buying things that would make you feel like you are, better than everyone else. Like, I think companies do that too sometimes, where they would maybe like spend a lot of money on having the fanciest office, things like that, or like
Mhm.
having crazy perks. But
Yeah,
a lot of the times it's
company
like,
jets, that sort of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, being like frugal is very important to the business survival. Like for example, in COVID 2020, the companies that spent a lot before, they probably had to, like, they suffered the most because they didn't save enough cash, versus like companies who are more frugal, less, aggressive.
Yeah.
They were willing, they were able to survive.
and it's harder for those companies. It's not just the saving aspect; it's the adjustment aspect as well. Because if you're used to, fancy offices, private jets, free course meals, for the managers and the executives, if you have to suddenly cut that out for the survival of your company, it becomes very hard for you to do that. But if you're always, being a bit, bootstrappy, always being a bit cautious with spending the money, if you have to do it a little more or a little longer, it's not that big of a deal. But those bigger companies, I bet you some of them failed, went down during COVID because they didn't change. Even though if they had, restricted themselves a bit, they would have been fine. But because they were so used to that extravagance, whatever the extravagance might be, it might be fancy offices, it might be, private planes, or it might just be, big projects internally that may not yield stuff for a long time, but they're so used to that way of working that they just didn't change.
Yeah, exactly. I think what you talked about is important. It's like for example, like people talk about lifestyle inflation, right? So
That's a big
people get
one.
a bigger paycheck, they increase their lifestyle, they get a better meal, they go on more traveling, or like this
Better
one.
car, second car,
Yeah, exactly.
that sort of
And
stuff.
then once you go there, it's hard to go back. So same as
It is.
companies, like what you said, it's you know obviously like as the company gets bigger, you want to have good perks, good healthcare. You want
Yeah.
to have good comfortable situation for the
Mm.
employees. That's also
You want to
important.
progress. I mean that, and that's not a bad thing. To
Yeah,
progress, to go away from just being a scrappy company. But again, it's getting that balance, because you'd rather progress a little slower, but maintain that progression than go so crazy that it gets to a point where you can't do anything but go back. Otherwise, you're gonna fail.
yeah, exactly. So like just being intentional of how you spend your funds, or your investors' funds, and personally just investing, you know, basically spending money on places that you think are that you actually will make you happy. That's very important.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, what's your favorite board game, video game, and movie?
Ooh, this is hard. So my favorite movie, I would say, is Forrest Gump.
Okay,
Uh, I watched that movie like
classic.
probably like 20 times. The first time I watched it, I was in middle school. Didn't really understand it. Um, I didn't really understand the historical references.
Yeah,
Uh, and then, or is it in high school? I kind of forget. But then I started watching it, more and more. And if it's on the plane, if I see Forrest Gump on the plane, they usually don't have it anymore. I always rewatch it.
that's
But
actually the place that I watched it for the first time, was on a airplane. I mean, that's the only place I've ever only watched it once, and he was on an airplane. He was on there, and there wasn't much else that I really wanted to watch. And he was a bit before the iPad days, where now I just, if I'm on a plane, I don't even I'm not even that fussed about what they've got on there, because I'd rather just take my own tablet, load the stuff that I know I definitely want to watch, especially if
right,
I'm behind on stuff. I'll watch that. Like, that to me is far more attractive than seeing what's on the movie list. Sometimes it's nice to see when you see something, you'd be like, oh, that's a bit of a surprise. But back in the day, Forrest Gump was on. Nothing else was on that I really wanted to watch.
yeah.
Everyone talked about it, so I'll put it on. Fairness, I didn't like it. I wasn't the biggest
Oh,
fan of it,
really?
but I've said to myself, I want to watch it again because I've never, seen it since, and I watched it in probably not the best setting to
Hmm.
really enjoy a movie of that caliber, the way that people talk about it. So I'm gonna give it another go.
Yeah, definitely give it another go. I think the first time I watched it when I was younger, I didn't understand it, so didn't seem. There were a lot of references that they do
Mm,
that now I'm like, oh wow, that's like really clever. Every time you rewatch a movie or book, you always discover something new. And I think that's the beauty of rewatching things. And like different stages of your life, you understand things a little bit differently as well. So Yeah, that's my favorite movie. I don't really play video games, but board games I play a lot. I like the lying board games, the ones that you have to like lie a little bit.
Okay, like what do you mean? Like which one?
Have you heard of Avalon or like One Night in Werewolf, things like
I
that?
have not. I am gonna, Google them after
Yeah,
Avalon.
check it out.
Avalon board
Yeah,
game. Okay.
it's pretty popular. But at least within my friends, but it's just like a lot of strategy, a lot of lying. So yeah, that's kind of the game that I like the most.
Okay. And my final question, which is a two-parter:
Yeah.
does money buy you happiness, and what does a good life mean to you?
Mm. Okay, so the first part, does money buy happiness? In my eyes, I think it has to be. I would say it has to reach to a point where your basic needs are covered,
Mm-hmm.
and on top of that, you have some discretionary income to do things that you like to do. So like
Yeah.
pick up hobbies, things like that. But also, I read about uh, a book. I think a book was talking about money and happiness, and it was like you there's research that's shown that like if everyone made $50,000 and you made $75,000, you would be happier than everyone, or you make 75,000, or you make $80,000 and everyone else makes $100,000. So it's
It's
relative.
definitely relative. I've heard about those case studies, and I
Yeah.
think maybe even that specific book as well, because it's one of those things I've come across when I've researched this over the years, and I think that it makes sense when you just sit there think about it. It is very relative.
Yeah. I think for me, I think money does buy happiness, but unless the money buys the experience. So like I went to Chicago this weekend. I, been on trips that I really enjoyed, that really opened my mind. And I couldn't do that without money, right? So, money I think buys a lot of experiences that you can have, that will make you really happy. Or it could be that, money also buys freedom. Like let's say I have enough money to never have to work a 9 to 5 for the rest of my life, then that's freedom that I get to choose what I want to do every time I wake up. Versus right now, obviously, I work at Airbnb, and if wake up tomorrow and I don't want to work, then I have to quit. Then I don't get paid. So I think money does buy happiness, but not like once you reach a level of like a lot of money, I feel like it really doesn't change like a whole lot.
Oh yeah, for sure. But the interesting thing is, what are you classifying as basic needs? Because I feel like everyone has a slightly different classification. Because obviously you can look at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and go from that approach, but
Mhm.
like everyone will have their differences, and there'll be a huge part of it will be your upbringing. Because somebody that's been in really dire situation, the upbringing hasn't been the best. I feel like their standards for having a baseline is going to be a lot lower than somebody who's grown up in with parents that were millionaires, and they was going on holidays left, right, and center. Like they're all going to have a baseline. They're all going to have the basic needs, but their basic needs will be different. Like, and when you talk, and you was also saying a set amount of money, or you might be set amount of cash flow. Like, what specifics right now do you have in mind?
Yeah, so for me, it's um, like I'll just come with an example. Like, let's say, uh, my monthly expense is $3,000.
Hmm.
Dollars. Being, I would say, having the cash flow to never work again is having a principal there, but also it covers your monthly expense. Ideally, a little bit more. So let's just say your passive income, you make $4,000 a month, and your monthly expense is $3,000 a month. And in order to achieve that, you need $1 million at 4%, right? So
Yeah.
you, uh, well, a little bit more, but in the grand scheme of math, let's just say you have a $1 million, it provides you around $4,000 a month. Then it covers your monthly expense. Then at that point, you could keep working, but you're financially free. Like you technically, unless you increase your expenses, if you have like kids or like you have a, you try to buy a house, things like that. But at that point in time, you're financially free because your passive income covers um, your monthly expense, but you still have your principal untouched. So I think that's kind of like my goal specifically is to reach to a point where the passive income covers my monthly expense. And then when that happens, then I get a lot more freedom to the things that I want to do. And I do enjoy like working at Airbnb, so it's not like I'm gonna quit immediately, but it's the goal is to reach to that point, to have the freedom to make your own decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a very, important thing is when people talk about, or when I've talked about, having so much money that you can do what you want, you can quit what you want, and people take it as, oh, you know, they, because when you say that, I want so much money that I can retire tomorrow, that I'll never have to work again, and then like people's immediate response is, so you want to just like quit and start working. So it's like, no, it's about having that choice, about decide, waking up and saying, I'm actually not enjoying what I'm doing. I'm not feeling that it's a good use of my time. Maybe you're working 5 days a week and you've got a family, and you wake up and think, I want to spend more time with them. I want to spend more time with my kids. I want to work, but I only want to work 3 days a week. Most people don't have that luxury because they've got to pay the bills. They've got to maintain the life. Like they're struggling to maintain their current lifestyle, which for most people isn't even the best anyway. So they've got to do that. And like they can't even comprehend the idea of, reducing your working hours, your working days by 40% from 5 to 3. It's just not something that's in their, you know, wheelhouse, in their mind. So having the money to choose and then say, okay, I want to work on this. And maybe you really want to work at a company, like you've made a bunch of money, you want to work at a company, and maybe you want to work at Google, for example, or let's say Airbnb, for example. Usually, most people, like I remember at uni, everyone had, a lot of people had the idea, I want to work at this company, and then or in this field, for example. You look at where they ended up working after they, finished university. None of them were, like, bar from one, were worked at where they wanted to, or in the kind of field they exactly wanted to, for the simple reason that, they took the job that first came, that gave them an offer that was had decent, pay, decent perks. Whereas if you have the money, you could say, I want to work for Airbnb. It might take me a couple of years to get the job. That's fine. I'll just hone my, coding skills, my engineering, my design, whatever it is. I'll even do some work for free for them, some volunteer work. It's so I think money definitely does give you a lot of freedoms that can lead to a happy, life. But it's knowing where that boundary is, what's gonna, really give you more in your life, and what's just extra for the sake of extra. Because the difference between 100 million and 200 million in terms of lifestyle is probably little to none. Whereas if you just look at the difference, which is 100 million or double, it's a lot, but the actual difference in your lifestyle is virtually none.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's all, the questions I've got. I really want to thank you, Ted, for coming onto the podcast to discuss your work at Hotel Tonight, Airbnb, and, previously on Chartboost. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm positive it'll be very insightful for the audience out there. So, thank you very much. And yeah, it's been a good one. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you so much. Have a good
Take
day.
care. And everyone, stay tuned for the next episode of FireDEV next week. Bye bye.